Welcome to Face2Face. This is a show about change and about what's next. It's a show that wants to ask questions, peel back the layers of our average everyday experience, and go beyond scratching the surface. We interview amazing people with incredible ideas and stories who have done wild, weird, and wonderful things. Remember that imagination shared creates collaboration, and collaboration creates community, and community inspires social change. I'm David Peck, and this is Face2Face. So my next interview is with Loretta Todd, and we talk about her new film that she has adapted from a novel by Eden Robinson called Monkey Beach. Grace Dove was going to join us in this conversation, but what's even cooler than the three of us having a conversation together is that there is also a conversation on Face2Face with Grace that's coming up in the very near future, if it hasn't already been published. So look for that, talking not only about Monkey Beach, but about her work and about reclaiming Indigenous identity and about the Kiri and the Dead Girl, a new film that she is working on and will be, I think, coming soon to a digital theater near you. Loretta and I get into a whole lot. I mean, Loretta should be teaching a course not only on film, but I think she should be teaching a course in philosophy and existentialism. I mean, I think she referred to herself as the semiotic princess. Actually, we talk about alienation and impression. We talk about, storytelling, really, and I mean, this is a labor of love. This film that she clearly so much of her is in this film. We talk about staying ahead of the curve and about agency and about the history of being displaced and about how do you make a place home and what actually is Indigenous storytelling. And she talks about it being in the bones and about it being in the blood. We talk about something called, that she refers to as elliptical and lyrical and we talk about ways in. Isn't that lovely? And narrative anchors and this lovely phrase of hers, the eddies of despair, and how breath is actually a life force. And boy, we cover a lot of ground. The delicate space we live in, learning journeys, and how every place, has a story. And it's a beautiful film. It's a historical piece. It's a love letter, I think, to, can I say this? A love letter to all of creation, to all of relationship and who we are, and this world that we exist in. I just recently interviewed Shane Belcourt about his new series Amplify, and he talks about this sense of holistic creation and how we need to be so much more aware of the relationships that we have with everything and everyone. And I think that's really explored well in the film Monkey Beach as well. So stay tuned for that conversation coming up in the very near future with Loretta Todd and a film that was at TIFF, but also at Vancouver Film Festival and coming soon to a digital theater near you. Don't forget davidpecklive.com for more information about my writing and speaking. And also you can learn more there, obviously, but you can also purchase a copy of my book, Real Change is Incremental. I would love that. And if you've landed on this interview and it's the first time you're here, and even if it's not the first time you're here, you may get here through iTunes or Spotify or something along those lines. If you do, check us out on Face2Face, face2facelive.ca. That's where we exist. Library value is significant. We've got over 530 interviews published there. We have a newsletter you can sign up for, and we can also advertise with us there as well. So reach out and ask us about that. You can advertise in the podcast, on the site, in the newsletter. There's a lot of different ways. Our audience is growing. And I'm going to reach out to you now, the listener. If you're enjoying what you're hearing and what we're doing here, please, if you could leave us a review on iTunes, that would be brilliant. The more news, the merrier out there. If you're listening on YouTube, give us a thumbs up. Step in and just take a few minutes to say thanks and say hello in some way. We would really appreciate it. Sign up for the newsletter. Don't forget that. And just before Loretta joins us here, rabble.ca. I'm also hosted over there. Face2Face has been there for quite a few years now, alongside of a whole lot of other thinkers and bloggers and posters and podcasters and writers, journalists, news for the rest of us. So check us out there as well. But in the meantime, stay tuned for a conversation about a new film called Monkey Beach with Loretta Todd. Well, welcome to Face2Face. We are joined by a very special guest here with us today. We have a filmmaker, director, writer, producer. Loretta Todd is here today to talk about her new film, Monkey Beach. Loretta, thank you for taking the time today on this. Well, it's a beautiful Friday afternoon here in Toronto. What's it like for you?
It's a beautiful afternoon here in Vancouver. Well, Gibson's actually where I live. So yes, and thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Thanks for taking the time today to chat. And I'm kind of in the middle of the Toronto International Film Festival, and all things COVID related are certainly making it an interesting experience to say the least. And your new film, Monkey Beach, is going to be at the Vancouver Film Festival. Can you give my listeners just a little bit of context about the film and about how it kind of came together? And then I'd love to just dive right into some of the issues.
Sure. Okay. Sounds great. And I'm just going to also let you listeners know that we also are screening as part of the TIFF Industry Select.
Yes.
So that's exciting. That will be happening on Sunday for industry and media. So,
very exciting.
Yeah, it's very exciting.
Yeah. And congratulations on the film, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
So it's a long story. It's a long journey. It depends on where you want to start, but I guess I will start with how it kind of came to be.
Sure.
So I was actually asked to direct a film based on another book by a producer who was in the process of trying to option that book. And unfortunately, he wasn't able to option it. But I had watched the process and I thought, I could see this. And there's a lot of books I would love to bring to screen. So somewhere in there, I happened to be going to a media event in Vancouver. And while I was there, a producer came up to me whose name escapes me with this kind of COVID mind that sort of sunk in a little bit. And she said to me, gee, you should option Monkey Beach. And I said, why? And she said, because your filmmaking is like her writing. So that was sort of like, oh, well, I'm intrigued. Now I have to go get the book. So I went out and bought the book. And then even before I started reading it, I looked at the acknowledgements, and Eden Robinson had acknowledged me in her acknowledgements for, being an influence. And, she had used one of my films for research for one of the characters in the book, but also, I guess, just people who she admired. So that also seemed very like a good sign. So then I reached out to her and she said, yes, she would be keen for me to try to option it. And then after that, I reached out to her agent, and from there, the process started. I'd never done anything like that before. And of course, I had to bring my lawyer in eventually to help with the process. But we worked out a deal. And then the next step, which is really how to get the financing to be able to develop the film, at least at this point, write scripts, find people to support it, find people who want to be part of it. So I eventually partnered with Jeff Bear, who is an Indigenous filmmaker and producer in his own right, and we had been friends. So I said, let's try to make this an all Indigenous produced, directed, and written project. So we set out to do that. We were, as most of my career has been, kind of ahead of the curve. This was back in the early aughts. And though everyone was very supportive and encouraging, and from Greenberg and Telefilm and, some of the broadcasters we approached, it was a daunting task. It's an epic book. It's an iconic book. Has many, many layers of story, and its way of storytelling is exactly as that woman described. It's in terms of the our styles. It's very elliptical. It's dealing with many harsh realities, but harsh realities told within the context of people's lives, people's histories, communities' histories, the land, the framing it against, thousands and thousands of years of people living on that land.
Loretta, as I'm listening to, I mean, this is a film about, and I often will, I didn't tell you this, but I do a little blurb or a little bio intro before all of my interviews that I post, usually right after I've finished having my conversations with, directors and actors and so on. And I mean, this is a film about memory. It's about history. It's about pain and trauma and PTSD. It's about the church. It's a spiritual film. It's an exercise in time and metaphor. I mean, there's just so much going on here. I mean, talk about an act of filmic juggling. I don't know, is that a phrase? Anyway, it's really quite remarkable what you've pulled off.
Well, it was also very painful. Because of those stories,
right.
Because of those histories, and of course, there's every Indigenous person has similar stories, and has similar experiences. But also, as a filmmaker, how do you choose this part over that part? How do you say I got to? And in the beginning, I wanted every part. I mean, how can I not? There's her life as a child, her life as a teenager, her life, as a young adult, her family's lives, the characters, the intersections of all these people's lives together, and the histories that sort of precede them, and how she can, on one page and even one paragraph, shift between all of those and do it so deftly and so beautifully and so lyrically, and take us into those places of trauma, and yet not be sensational and exploitive of those. So how do I sort of match that? How do I live up to that? And how do I capture the essence? Because of course, in the beginning, our scripts were 150 pages long, because really that's what the bare minimum needed to be there. My opinion as a filmmaker, but the people saying, well, that's too long. It's budget. It's all these things. So how do I get to the essence? How do I find that essence of the story? And that's something that, has always been a challenge.
So Loretta, I've studied philosophy for years, and existentialism has had a real impact on me, French and German existentialism, and just this whole sense of being intentional and how I am who I am in relationship to my kids and to my wife and to my friends and to the people I interact with and so on. One of the opening lines in the film, I believe, Lisa says to Tabitha, "What are you doing here?" Right? Like right out of the gate, we've got this pretty big sort of metaphysical question, and then for me, the film, and I've really found this theme in the last few years of just finding our way back home. And Lisa and Jimmy and just all of the history here. I mean, can you talk about that sense of home, that sense of community, and that just sense of, I guess, being here? I mean, those are pretty big questions and big notions, but boy, I think you explore them beautifully in the film.
Well, you're sort of going to really challenge me, aren't you? When I was at film school, I was sort of like the semiotic, princess. I was able to kind of,
that's a great phrase.
Yes.
Yeah.
I was able to kind of move very, smoothly between all these, critical theories of Marxism and all these, sort of Freudian stuff and all these stuff that was sort of like de rigueur, in the day of film analysis. But it's been a while, I have to say, although I happened to write an essay once, which actually kind of looked at that, tried to say, what is the existential sort of journey within Western culture, drawing from the metaphor of the, myth of the cave. Well, is ours the myth of the cave? Where does our stories originate? Do they originate in that sense of alienation and oppression? And, even though we have been oppressed and alienated because of Western colonization and so on, that's not where we first see ourselves. If and I started looking at the stories within
Sure.
Indigenous culture, and there certainly is sort of some similarities. There's the raven steals the sun, and this idea of the trickster sort of bringing light, bringing knowledge. But there's still a sense within Indigenous storytelling that, how can I say, without sounding like an essentialist, because I used to always be accused of being.
And hey, listen, you don't have to go all academic
I
on
know,
us
but
either,
I
right?
was accused of being an essentialist for a long time.
That's so. I love it.
That was a group of us, it's in the bones, it's in the blood,
right. Yeah, that's a great phrase. It's in the bones, it's in the blood. Yeah.
So we don't need to be freed from the cave, to be able to come to ourselves, to come to knowledge, and so that's something I think that you really see embodied in Eden, even though Eden's dealing with all this trauma and this colonial legacy. There's always the sense that all her characters have agency. Now they may not be able to overcome that colonial legacy, that trauma, but there's still the sense that they have legacy. I mean, they have agency.
They have agency. Yeah.
And I think that was something that was really kind of critical. And if you ask that question, what are you doing here? Well, that's the question of agency, right? And so, I mean, I think home has always, in some ways, plagued me. I mean, I come from this sort of mixed background of Métis who were always being displaced. Our whole history is about being displaced, from the Red River. I'm one of the original Métis families. We were displaced there. My family just went, everywhere we went, we were sort of displaced. Fortunately, a few along the line kind of married into some reses and, became part of those territories. But eventually my grandfather is at the St. Paul de Métis, and he marries an Indigenous woman from the Whitefish Lake First Nations, nearby. But then that land was displaced as well. So I have this whole kind of history of displacement in my own, experience. And yet at the same time, how do you still find home? I mean, there's obviously, how do you still make home, and how do you carry home with you? And that's something, that culture, that story, that all the elements of who we are as a people, transcend the material comfort of a home. But there's another part of home, and home is the land. So what does that mean? What does that sort of, and how does that play in our lives? And, in the kind of the Plains way, I consider myself both Métis and Cree. In the Plains way, we say all my relations. And all my relations is referring to this idea that I have a relationship with, is what I've been taught anyways, relationship with the rocks and the plants and all the beings that are alive, and all are alive in that space. So home has, many, many meanings. But at the same time, I've also made films that look very specifically at home. So when I made a film about, with the Kainai people, about the return of some of their objects, from another time, the film was basically structured around leaving home, and then coming home. So that was sort of, when I did that, looking at these objects that were coming home. So I'm going off on these tangents, but I mean,
it's great. Tangents are amazing.
But to get to Monkey Beach, that's not my home.
Right.
So I'm not Haisla. I never grew up in that territory. I'm very fortunate in some ways, and I guess some people would say maybe unfortunate in others. But I ran away from home when I was 13. I ran away to the West Coast, to Vancouver. So in a way, I've been more on these lands than I have been on the plains, where I was, born and made. So I have a kind of found a delicate way, and hopefully a good way, to negotiate what is my relationship as a non-West Coast or non-Haisla person who's living in these people's territories. And what does that mean in terms of how I make my home here? So those were always kind of in the back of my mind. So as far as home, when I'm in awe of all Indigenous peoples everywhere who stand up for their home. because they're not just standing up for themselves. They're standing up for every blade of grass, every branch, every rock, every fish, every bug. I mean, that's, everything that's there, and all the bones of the ancestors who, came before them. So, in a way, that sort of, as a filmmaker, as a storyteller, I'm responsible for, even if I'm not from that territory, I'm responsible for honoring all aspects of that when I make a film in a community.
Loretta, it's about relationship, and for me, not all relationships imply respect, but I guess they should, if I can be prescriptive, in the sense of, your comment about, everything, every living thing, every blade of grass. It's a beautiful phrase, and isn't that the way we should be stepping into our days, right? I mean, with all that's going on right now in the world, COVID and race relations and the pushback and this politics of hate that we seem to see everywhere, right? I mean, you don't have to read too far or too deeply on CBC or BBC or Al Jazeera to see it. Can you talk about that sense of respect and relationship and I want to get to death too. I mean, you really do take on some difficult issues in this film, but again, you do it in such a beautiful and cinematic way.
Well, interesting because, sorry, I've just, as far as, so you're going to have to ask me that question again. So just give me the context for it again one more time.
So just the idea of relationship and being in relationship to everything and everyone else. And, and we can talk about it existentially, right? We are who we are because of that, right? That respect. And yet so many of us don't go there, actually, right?
When I was sorry to cross talk.
No, go.
When I was fortunate, so that, I had this sort of strange life, and somewhere, along the line was able to be embraced and accepted by a lot of people here, and started doing work in media way back in the day before I'd gone to film school or anything. And I remember meeting with the beautiful elder, Mary Uslick, who's passed away. And I remember her saying, she was a healer, saying how every day she woke up, she went out and she thanked the cedar, and she thanked the sun, and she thanked the air, and she thanked the water. And, think how differently our lives would be if every day we all did that, because it's humbling and it's also puts you into a different consciousness. And so you can't just go clear cut every forest because you've just thanked that forest for its life, for what it does, not just because it's pretty, but because it provides a habitat for other things that need to thrive within that habitat. So there's so much in terms of relationship. And I think in a way, when you think about it in Monkey Beach, a lot of what the trauma is the oppression. The trauma is but the trauma is also the severing of those relationships. I mean, they really want us to not have a relationship to land, to all our relations. They don't want us to have relationships with one another. I mean, even, they divide us all the time, within the arts community and the film community, all that. There's just all these kind of ways in which, and it affects non-Indigenous people too. It's a culture that is always about fracturing, always about creating, smaller and smaller enclaves and elites and so on. So there's never this idea of expansiveness, of everybody being, in the circle and part of the circle. So in a way, there's this, Monkey Beach is kind of a revisiting of these severings of these relationships, and ultimately, including, Lisa's, sort of like severance from that power that she has, that supernatural power that she has, and how it has to kind of be restored. So yeah, I do think if we lived with that very simple act of giving thanks every day for everything, how different culture would
it reminds me of the lesson. It reminds me of lesson number 1 of contacting the dead. What is it? Concentrate on nothing and everything at the same time. Isn't that kind of what's necessary in order to give thanks in a more intentional way?
Yeah, I think so.
It's wonderful.
I think so for sure. Yeah, there's definitely a
It seems like an act of, certainly, if not prayer, certainly an act of meditation of and just and for me, but just personally, what I took from the film, this act of just being more present, right? And I love the moment when I think, remind me if this is true or not, but I think when Jimmy and Lisa meet again for the first time, I think she says to him, "You're safe," and he responds, "No, you're safe."
yeah, yeah,
When that's like, that's the essence of this story, right? That, to me, and yet so layered and so nuanced and just so complex on so many levels. How so you read the novel, you how do you start into a script like this? I mean, was it more of a community thing for you, or did you just sort of lock yourself in a room and I'm gonna hammer this out over the next several months?
We first asked Eden to write the script, and she was very keen to do it. But the more she got into it, the more she realized she couldn't revisit that world that
Interesting.
she
Okay.
had struggled. Like, it's not easy, I mean, you can imagine. So when she went to write it, she said, I can't revisit it. It's just too painful, because those characters come alive for her, so she's with them again. And so we tried. And so then I took it on, and, I thought I did okay job, and I kept trying to kind of move the project forward. And each time we would take it back to Telefilm, and they would say, "Well, it's almost there. It's almost there." So we kept trying to get to where we wanted to go. And by that point, we're starting to run out of money, and now we have to find what can we do, like how can we take it further so that we can get more support. So this is where Jeff and I kind of had a creative what's the word kind of falling out. But it was amicable, it was respectful, and he wanted to go one direction with the writer, and I wanted to go another
that's
direction.
got to be pretty hard
With the writer, and so we decided that we would part ways. Which I respect him a lot as a filmmaker, as a storyteller, as a producer, and all only love and respect for him and his family and people he works with. So somewhere in there, that happened. So then I took it on again on my own, and I had money. We had kind of maxed out what development money we could get. So now it was, can I find writers who are prepared to work with what I've already done, and see if we could take it closer to what we need to do. So I brought on these two writers, Johnny Darrell and Andrew Duncan, who were friends really, and who knew I had no money, but were excited about the opportunity to be able to actually collaborate and try to create the script. And I think what's really good about them, especially because they have this history, they're both animation directors and work in animation a lot, they have a good sense of structure. And I think that's what was kind of missing, because I'm in love with the elliptical, I'm in love with the lyrical, I'm in love with just letting the story flow and eddy, and not necessarily have to adhere to the plot points and the things that obviously give comfort to financiers, but also give it to be respectful of the viewer, also give viewers anchors, ways in,
right. Sure. Yep.
So that was what we did. They then sort of said, okay, we'll take this and see what we can do with it. And we had our creative differences. I didn't want to go too dark, because I feel like I have seen so many dark Indigenous films that need to be told. Those stories need to be told, and those people have the, whatever it is that they need, whatever medicine that they need to be able to go there. But for me, I wanted something where at the end of the film, young Indigenous women and all Indigenous women, and indeed all women, can stand up and say, I want to be like Lisa. I can be like Lisa. And
well, ultimately it's a story of hope and healing, really, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. I think that I didn't want to kind of stay in the eddies of despair. I wanted to be able to show. I mean, the other thing I wanted to do too is the fact that, so here's a woman with what, I sometimes call like, who has medicine. I don't want to say medicine man because that's something that, has been used derogatory and misunderstood. But here's a woman who has medicine. She has this medicine to be able to go to this place of death. But she goes, but so what does that mean? What does that mean to her people? What does that mean to her? What does that mean to, her family? And so to me, that was a journey that women have been going on in Indigenous communities for thousands and thousands and thousands and years and generations. So that story happened sometime in another time, not in the context of colonization, not in the context of the traumas that we're going through now, but in the time where someone had to come to terms with their power. And we'll go on again in 1,000 years. There will be another Lisa who has to come to terms with her power. And so what was important for me is to try to capture I don't want to say endless, but that's a, well, to your word, existential journey, right? An existential journey within Indigenous context, because she has a very unique supernatural power, but within the Indigenous sense that we all have some medicine that we carry.
Right.
And that medicine is intended for protection, to keep the people safe. And that's kind of the journey that I sort of hope to set Lisa on in terms of the film.
I love the notion that we all carry with us some kind of medicine, and what that might be is, obviously up for discussion and conversation, but I really do love that notion. There's so many great lines in the film, and I want to talk about something Karaoke says right near the end, because I'm kind of on my podcast and the people I interview, I'm all about that sort of call to action. I consider myself, a bit of an activist, I suppose. Yeah. And I think Lisa says I can't remember who she says it to, but how do you breathe deep with meaning? This is a very profound question. And I think it's beautiful. And it's like worth the price of admission, Loretta, to walk out of the theater ruminating on that is that takes a lifetime, it seems to me. I don't know if you've ever practiced yoga, or meditating, or how can we be present? How do we do it with meaning? I think it's wonderful. Can you tell me a little bit around that, where that came from? Is that right out of the book?
You're going to try my brain to remember if it comes from the book or some of the lines. We literally took lines right from the book, right? Just like, and then there are other lines. Of course,
why wouldn't you?
Yeah. And then there are other lines that were added, the land of the dead, contacting the dead kind of thing. Some of that's direct, some of that I wrote. So I can't remember if that one at this point, just because my brain's a little, COVID fried, but at the same time, it's a beautiful line, and it's actually her grandmother who speaks it to her.
Yes.
And so it's something. And as you're saying that, it's actually, when you think about it, when you think about all the healers, and in the traditional way, they use breath. They use breath a lot. And when you think about even song in the traditional sense, in the native sense, and in the drum, there are also expressions of breath and heartbeat. So basically life,
right? The
life force. I think that's the thing that, in all Indigenous ways, and I think in all cultures, but just, some of them have been kind of gotten tied up in knots by, the other sides of Christianity, the sort of the shame-based culture that sort of been, evolved out of it. But in any case, this idea of breath, this idea of how breath is our life force, and how every day when, again, those elders get up to give thanks, they give thanks for their breath. And they use breath in song. They use it in song is used as healing, and they use breath in healing, and even just the healing ceremonies that use the flaps of the feathers of eagles and stuff is a form of breath.
Sure.
So there's a sense of, and and our people, having done Coyote Science about Indigenous science, the children's series, our people were aware of this, the breath of the forest, the breath of the ocean, that there was a symbiotic relationship that was there, but that was achieved
It's
at
interesting. Yeah.
and so Leroy Little Bear is one of my mentors, if you like, and he says, that this space we live in, this very delicate space we live in,
Mm,
how magnificent it is, because if you try to hold your breath too long, you no longer are a part of it.
mm.
So breath is, yes, very, very, very critical.
I love that's beautiful. I love the breath of the ocean, the breath of the forest, the breath of whatever. I think the implication for me is everything's alive. We're in relationship to everything. It's just this reminder once again of respect, of how we treat others, and how we only know ourselves. In relationships. In relationship to those, those very things. We got to wrap it up in a few minutes here, but I want to. Karaoke has a wonderful line, and remind me if it's not her, but I think near the end, she's talking with Leah, and I hope we're not giving too much away here, but she says something about everyone looking away, and it's about time someone did something. It's not what you've done, it's what you do, I believe. And I might be mixing up a couple pieces of dialogue there, but I just, once again, that takeaway, that call to action, is that would you say that's the big hope for you with Monkey Beach, that I'll walk out of the theater, or having watched it on Crave. I believe it's coming in November, by the way. We'll talk about that before we wrap up. Is it about hope? Is it about healing? Is it about history? Is it about educating me, the viewer? I'm imagining it's about way more than just one thing, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, Loretta, before we close.
What's interesting about Eden's book is that when she takes you on these learning journeys, when she takes
Mm,
you into these
nice.
places, like this is the Kitlo, and she
Right.
gives you stories that are attached to that place. I mean, when she and I went up to the real Monkey Beach with her dad and her cousin, along the way he told us stories all the way. And this is where the Haidas did this, and this is where we
Mm,
did this, and this is where,
nice.
and then some of them are ancient stories, some of the things that happened with him, in his own life. So every place has a story, and so I think that to me was kind of at the core of a lot of this. Is why it was important for me to make the film there. That these stories inhabit every space,
Mm,
and
it's
that
good.
we have to
It's
sort of
so
honor
good.
those stories and honor those places, and that's sort of the core of the healing. I didn't want it to be. I didn't want it to be where I have to educate white people about residential school. I don't have to educate people. White people, Canadians, non-Indigenous Canadians, that's your job. Like
Right.
I remember a
Right.
friend of mine who came
Right.
from Trinidad, great filmmaker and producer Selwyn Jacobs. And he said, I hope he doesn't mind me saying this, but he said, he came from Trinidad, and of course he was colonized as well, but he came from Trinidad, and he said within a couple of years, he quickly figured out, this was in the 60s, 70s, quickly figured out about residential schools. And
Mm.
so I don't know, when all these Canadians who say, well, I've never heard of residential schools, I can't believe it, I don't know how this ever happened.
Right. Well, I
It's
love how
like,
you say it's your job. It's great. Talk about responsibility. I've interviewed Selwyn, by the way, Loretta.
yeah, he's a lovely
Uh,
man, and
he is, yeah, a few
it's
years back.
and it's really it's. I mean, that's I didn't want to burden that I didn't want to take away from Lisa's journey, that
Mm,
journey that's ancient, that's and will be ancient again, for
right.
generations in the future, because it's a healing journey, but it's a healing. As she heals herself, she heals, she's also bringing healing to the community. So I think that was really, really critical to me, that so we're dealing with trauma, we're dealing with the effects of abuse, we're dealing with the effects of secrets, in communities, and not just Indigenous communities. I think one of the the dirty little secret of Canada is, how not just the Catholic Church, but the fundamentalist Christian churches, the bad things that go on within there that somehow get, brushed under the carpet all the time because, well, they're white. But nonetheless, somehow, it's just, But anyways, that's another story.
It is, and another podcast, but one
Another
that
podcast. But I
we
mean, in
need,
the
but
meantime,
one we need to
yeah,
take heed of, right? And we
yeah.
need, and I think your comment about that's your job is perfect. I mean, it's time to peel back the layers, and I think that's what Monkey Beach does. I think the book does that, the film does that, and I love too how you talk about how other filmmakers who might have made darker stories, that's part of their medicine, right?
That's part of
And
their
what's
medicine. But my
maybe
medicine,
that's the takeaway, right? For all
but
of us,
yeah, my
all
medicine is different. My medicine, I think,
yes.
has always been to give hope, and I've been criticized for that. The
Nice.
very first film I made, The Learning Path, back in the day, I didn't have as nice publicist as Nicola to work with, and so I had this publicist going around with me to do different interviews, and we're waiting between interviews, and it's outside an office, and while we're talking, she says, "Well, that's not really the way it is." And I said, "What?" I said, she says, "You keep talking about hope." She says, "That's not really the way it is in your community." She said, "It's just poverty and it's just abuse and it's alcoholism and all this kind of stuff." And I said, "Excuse me." I said, "I asked every elder in that film that I made, what kind of film do you want to make?" And they all said, "A hopeful film." When I made Forgotten
So
Warriors,
good.
I asked all the veterans in the film, "What kind of film do you want to make?" And they said, "A hopeful film." When I asked every single film I've ever made, I've always asked the people in the film and and they've all been, indigenous people, what kind of, they've always said hopeful. No matter what we've been through, the hell we've been through, our people continue to be hopeful because they know we're guided by the land, they're guided by our ancestors, they're guided by, the blood and the bones. And, that has to give us hope. So those are the kinds of films that I want to make because I don't want another Indigenous girl to feel shame. I don't want another Indigenous girl to feel like she's not worthy. I want every Indigenous girl and young woman to feel I have medicine. And that's the thing I want them to take away. Yes, we still have battles. Yes, there's
Sure.
systemic battles. There's still racism. There's still, we're still being murdered and still being killed, and we're all these things that happen in our communities. Police are still shooting us. The horrors that we have to go through, on a daily basis. And yeah, I wanted people to know that they have medicine. And Lisa has medicine. They have medicine.
Medicine and hope. Thank you for your time today. I mean, I've so enjoyed our conversation, Loretta. I mean, talk about barely scratching the surface. For me, it's a sign of a great conversation. It's a sign of a great film. Thank you for taking the time today. Perhaps there's a part 2 in our future. Tell us real quickly though, September 24th, Vancouver International Film Festival. Coming up, going to be on Crave in November, I believe. Is that right?
Sometime in November, yeah.
Sometime in November. So look,
and then it will
okay.
Also be streaming on CBC, and APTN will also be broadcasting it after the Crave broadcasts. And we'll continue. The other beautiful thing about being screened in BC at the Vancouver Film Festival is that they're showing it in theaters, COVID-safe theaters of 50. But they're also bringing it out to theaters outside of Vancouver. So we'll be screening in Terrace, which is close to Kitimaat. And so the people who were in the film who work could come from Kitimaat to go to Terrace to see it. And then also we had people in Terrace who worked in the film in Prince Rupert. And then they're also showing it around in other places in BC, but I can't remember all of them right now. But they're small independent theaters around the province.
Well, what's beautiful is we can actually say that Monkey Beach is coming soon to a theater near you again.
Yeah. I don't know if they'll ever get into the big theaters. I mean, maybe
that's right. It's been a little while, right?
Maybe a distributor will pick it up, and who knows? Maybe we'll get a big release. But really, what's important is to get out to the people. And we had hoped to do it in Kitimaat, but because of COVID, we can't do an interior exhibit show, and because of the weather, we can't do an outdoor. So Terrace is the closest we could come to actually doing. We had thought about doing a drive-in. We really wanted to do a drive-in, but it's expensive. So
right.
So maybe some other thing. I keep
opportunities and limitations, but yeah, it sounds exciting. And congratulations again on the film. We've been talking to Loretta Todd today. If you've enjoyed,
add one more beautiful.
Yeah,
thing?
please.
I
Yeah,
just want to add a beautiful shout out to all my cast.
Oh, there you go. Yeah,
they
of
are the
course.
most, all my crew. I mean, the Sterling Bancroft, and it was an amazing cinematographer, but all the crew, lots of Indigenous crew, a
Some
lot of
talented
Indigenous
folk in this
crew
film.
from Kitimaat and from Terrace and Prince Rupert, and all the beautiful cast. It was really, really amazing, and they just gave so much of themselves. It was 20-day shoot, so it was a lot. We all had to drive, fly or drive up there. It's an 18-hour, 20-hour drive from Vancouver, so it's not an easy place to get to. And some of them even wanted to stay. Grace said she wanted to stay there because it's so beautiful. And we were so welcomed by the Haisla Nation and all the people in Kitimat. So big shout out and a lot of love to them. But I really feel like I think there's something to be said. Sometimes I think I'm not a kid, I can't pretend I got a body work behind me. But I think there's sometimes undervalued that what a person who's lived the life that I've lived brings to directing. And I like to think that in addition to my kind of, what should I say, my I hate to use sophistication because it makes it sound like I'm bragging. But in addition to my knowledge,
it's okay if you do.
In addition to my knowledge with the camera, my kind of, not even, I wouldn't say love affair, but my sort of respect for the camera and cinema. I also have great respect for the actors because they're storytellers. And so I have to, respect their breath. I have to respect, their relationship to their own bodies, where their own stories inhabit. And I said this in another interview, but I'll just say it quickly. When I made a documentary about the late Chief Dan George, and I was lucky enough to talk with Arthur Penn, who directed him in Little Big Man, and we talked about the because I brought it up. I said there seems to be, because I had studied a little bit about the actor studio, and I'm always trying to increase my craft as a director. So I studied acting, I studied cinematography, all these things you need to help you be a better director. But I said to him, I thought that there was some parallels between oral storytelling and the actor's studio system, because of this idea of being in the moment, and inhabiting the moment. And I tried as much as possible to give the actors that space to be in that moment and for their breath to really drive their performance. And
Loretta, isn't it lesson number 1 again? Concentrate on nothing and everything at the same time. And Chief Dan George, oh man, there's a guy who understood the power of breath, it seems to me.
Energy. It's all energy.
It's variations. Yeah. It's all energy.
It's all energy.
Loretta, thank you so much. What a pleasure chatting with you today. Loretta, Sera Todd, and her new film, Monkey Beach. Make sure you get out and see it. Please leave us a review here. We've been talking to Loretta today on Face2Face. Loretta, thanks again. Enjoy the festival. Going to be some Q&As coming up, and what a pleasure. Thanks for your time.
And to you as well. Thank you so much. Hi. And take care.